Well, welcome and good morning from Fairbanks, Alaska. I want to recognize the indigenous lands, traditional lands of where we are coming from, where I am coming from, and that is the Dana people of the lower Tanana River. I am extremely grateful to have an incredible panel to bring to you this morning. Our topic is the integration of indigenous ways of knowing and Western knowledge from a community-based perspective, and how do we operationalize One Health. We've had a very inspiring keynote speech this morning from Susan Coots and Jared Gannett, and I want to thank them very much for that and setting this panel up beautifully with that keynote address. And we have people who work on different sides of One Health, from the human and social science side of things, the natural science side of things, community members who have been part of research and designing and participating in it. And we span a good part of the Arctic here with Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Scandinavia represented. So what I'd like to do right now is go around and introduce our panelists and have them tell you a little bit about who they are and what they do, and then we'll get going with some questions. For those of you who are watching, please feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can in the time that we have. I'd like to start with Mr. Mike Williams Sr. He is an elder from Akiak, and Mike, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience in doing community-based participatory research and outreach, and also the ways of integrating Indigenous and Western ways of knowing. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Williams Sr. Kochchuk is my name. It is Sami name. The Sami elder drowned the day I was born across from Akiak. They were transported from Norway to Akiak to teach us how to herd reindeer. So my name is Kochchuk once again. I'm from the community of Akiak. I was born and raised there, and caught the glimpse of the old ways of living with no electricity, with no running water, no telephones, no technology at all. So I just got a glimpse of that very healthy way of life, and then got into government schools and boarding schools and military experience and education, and also involved in taking a look at the rapid changes that are affecting our people in our community, from a behavioral health perspective, and also our physical health and our emotional and spiritual health. So having spent a lot of time with our outgoing elders that passed on already, that I acquired a lot of traditional knowledge from them. They passed it on to me, and I wanted to make sure that I share this with Western scientists in how we can improve the quality of life in our communities, having healthy ways of life with clean water, clean environment, and making sure that our wildlife that we depend on to survive are healthy. So it's been quite an experience working with Oscar Kowagli, who is my uncle, who did a research on native ways of knowing, and spent a lot of time with him for 3 years, and also Eric Madsen, who was doing his dissertation on self-determination in providing education to our children in Akiak. I think this One Health concept, I think if we are going to do research, we are going to have to come together into an agreements that I just heard this morning that they are doing in Canada, and I think if we are going to do some research in our Indigenous communities, we have to come to an understanding and agreements because right now I'm serving as a tribal chief of my community, and I've been governing our community to fight for our sovereignty and also self-determination and protecting our way of life out here in the Kuskokwim River in Western Alaska. So I just wanted to introduce myself, thanking my parents and my grandparents for giving me all the information to have a good base for living. So I wanted to continue to share with a project with One Health, which I really believe that will help achieve our goals. So I'm going to continue to work on achieving those goals, even though I'm retired now. So the work is just beginning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, and really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Next, I'd like if Dr. Jessica Black could introduce herself and just tell us a little bit about who she is and the work that she does.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Sorry, my internet is not working properly, so I'm trying to get it fixed so I can be on video, but just like to say good morning to everyone. Bon Gwinzi, Shojri Jessica Blackoji, Gwachaje, Gwatsan Ithli, Gatanan Gwichi. I said good morning in my language. My name is Jessica Black, and my family's from Gwachaje or Fort Yukon, but I am honored to live and work here in Tanan, Fairbanks, on the traditional lands of the Lower Tanana Dene. And I just want to say, Masit Cho, thank you for their past, present, and future stewardship of these beautiful lands. I work at UAF in the Department of Alaska Native Studies, Rural Development, and Tribal Governance. And I am so fortunate to work, like I said, here at the UAF campus and be involved in different programs and research projects that all relate to One Health. And I grew up in a very traditional way with my grandparents. They had a fish camp downriver from Fort Yukon, and that early childhood experience fundamentally shaped my worldview and how I saw my plant, water, animal relatives. And I too was raised with a strong respect for our tribal sovereignty as Gwich'in people. As Mike said, tribal sovereignty is at the heart of not only our stewardship, but our wellness. And so a lot of my work focuses on the intersectionality of tribal governance and well-being for Indigenous people. And I'll actually be talking a little bit later this week in a keynote about that. But just wanted to say good morning and welcome to everybody from around the world. It's good to be here. Masit Cho.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you very much for joining us. Next, I'd like it if Dr. Jim Allen, who's got a foot in Alaska and a foot in Minnesota, could introduce himself and tell us a little bit about himself and the work he does.
Good morning, world. I would like to say hello from, as my elder friends say in their Bad River dialect, I'm on the shores of Gitche Gaming, which is the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people. And in English, it's called Lake Superior. I've been working, my training is as a Western scientist. I've been working since 1990 with communities in Alaska. And Mike, Oscar Coagley was, his office was right next to mine back in the last century in the 1990s. And I consider him one of my teachers. I'm greatly appreciative of the time he spent explaining things to me. And uh, he and another departed soul, Jerry Mohat, were both involved in a program of research that was called People Awakening, which was really influential on how I now think about research. One of the reasons it was so influential was it was about alcohol, but it was about Alaska Native people really coming to the university and saying, we're really unhappy with the nature of this health research. It's focused on problems and it ignores the reality of many Alaska Native people who don't drink or don't have drinking problems. And with that, they turned the research question on its head. They wanted to understand pathways to sobriety. And they described it not just it included people who abstained from alcohol, but many different relationships people had with alcohol. Um, After that study, uh, the community members came back to the university and said, well, we'd like you now to do something with this knowledge that contributes back to communities. And we'd like you to work with our young people and to take these ideas and apply them to youth well-being. And our team's been working on that for the last 25 years now. And it really has highlighted a number of the important issues we heard in our last keynote presentation about what science really can do to get out of the way of Indigenous knowledge and truly listen to community members and, a point of understanding from their viewpoint. And it's been one of the most rewarding and interesting experiences a person could ever have to be part of it. Back over to you, Arlie.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks again for making the time to be with us. I'd love to now move on to Jared and let him tell a little bit about himself and the work that he does.
Sure, I'll be pretty brief since you just saw me talking for a while there. But I'm a Taku River Tlingit citizen. I'm based in Whitehorse, Yukon, which is sort of kind of near the headwaters of the Yukon River in the Yukon, Canada. And right now I'm on the traditional territory of the Tonquachon Council in Kwalindon First Nation. And I'm a first-year PhD student. I work with Fiona Schmigelo, Crystal Mantaka Pringle, Brenda Parley, and Joe Copperjack. And I'm looking at biocultural indicators in the Yukon and developing them with Indigenous people here. Specifically, I'll be working with Nacho Nagdan and Trondakwishin, which are a couple nations in northern Yukon. And I'll keep it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared, and thank you again for your inspiring keynote. Next, I'd like to ask Susan to introduce herself and tell us a little about herself.
Sure. And again, you just heard a lot from me, so I'll keep it very brief. I'm from Alberta at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine in Calgary. And I guess, I think what has been very interesting to me in working in this area has been my own evolution from a graduate student who was focused on a problem of a lungworm in muskoxen to having my eyes opened about the importance of the muskoxen to the people in the communities I was working in. So it sort of shifted my view from this very academic focused perspective to this is a much more important thing than just a lungworm, and it's really part of a broader ecosystem. So through my career, I've watched the role of Indigenous knowledge become more and more at the forefront. I think when I started, there was a matter of consultation only. to a point in time now where we're really starting to mobilize this. So I think that's very exciting, but with lots of opportunities to improve what we're doing. And I guess I just want to mention one thing that I've actually learned while working with Jared as on this keynote, and that is the point about a healthy land relationship or and relationship planning versus wildlife management. I think that's very powerful. But I will leave it at that because you've heard enough from me already. Thank you, Farley.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you again for that really beautiful speech. Next, I'd like to go east a long ways and ask Christina Wiesken Larsen to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about herself and the work she does.
Thank you so much, and good morning. It's evening here. I'm sitting in Copenhagen right now, and I'm so sorry I missed the keynote. I was making dinner for my children, so I hope that I can catch it afterwards. And Ingelise and I were very honored to be a part of this. For some years, we've been wanting to move in a much more community-based direction, and all of you sitting on this panel are an inspiration to us. So I'll just share a little bit about where we are in the work that we do in Greenland, to sort of give you a sense, and also who am I? And then Ingelise will talk about herself. So I'm just gonna share. I wanted to show you where we're based. So I haven't been able to travel to our Nuuk office for a year now due to COVID-19, but when Ingelise and I are sitting in the same office, this is our building, and I'm the research director of the Center for Public Health in Greenland, which is based both at the University of Greenland here in Nuuk and also in Copenhagen. And we're a mix of Danish and Greenlandic researchers, and our background is that we, for many years, since the mid-90s, and Ingelise has been doing this longer than I have, but we've been conducting population-based health surveys, which has given us lots of insight into epidemiological challenges. So when Jim, you said it so nicely that, you know, being tired of focusing on problems, that's where we are right now, and we're trying to change that. But I'm also a mother and a wife, and my home is both in Copenhagen, which are some of the pictures that you're seeing right now, and then also in Greenland, where my husband, he's Inuk from the Disco Bay area. So this is my crew. And some of you I know have visited Greenland. Some of you might not have, but in Greenland, the population is 90% Inuit Gelashlit, people call themselves, and there are about 56,000 people. There are 80 communities. 16 communities or towns that vary in the size of 17,000, which is the capital, and then down to, you know, smaller towns like 1,000 inhabitants, and then a lot of villages. So it's it's an Inuit country. And for the past years, and Ingelise will tell you more about what we were actually doing, we really tried to learn from a lot of you guys and change the focus, shift the paradigm. Instead of only monitoring problems of alcohol and suicide, and I mean, although important and public health issues, then trying to you know, start from the community perspective, have community-driven research approaches, and have an understanding of well-being that is grounded in the Greenlandic community. And this is not how it's been. So what we're trying now is to, in close dialogue with communities, you know, find methods that make sense, and also define wellness in terminology that makes sense to people. And Ingelise will talk a little bit more about that. So I'll leave it at that and stop sharing.
I think it's my turn, so I will
Yes.
start, yes.
Thank you,
And
Ingelisa.
I'm not the technical one, but I will try to share and I think you will get it this way because ingidisam ataqarpunga innuttasut peqqissusiani ilisimatusarfiani ataqatigissaarisuuvunga quianaruussuarmaani sinnaagama, and I am saying my name is Ingelise Olesen and I am a research coordinator in our Center of Public Health in Greenland, and I'm born and I live and I'm raised and I'm working in Greenland. And all those pictures are what's important, a little bit of what is important for me. Being in the nature is very important for me and my family, and I think I share that with all of you in the Arctic. We collecting food, hunting and collecting and preparing food is very important for us, and it is my understanding of health in body, mind, and spirit. I will tell you a little bit about our work with evaluation of research methods based on the Galatlit Inuit values. And our background, our background is Center of Public Health. We have used the methods of sharing circles in two projects in 2019 and 2020. And the first was focusing on the people's perceptions of and experience with the public health. And we wanted to rethink the classic focus group methods, which has been used for many years here in Galatlit Nunaat. Being aware of use indigenous methodologies and respectful community-driven approaches in other Arctic regions, we decided to create a concept for a Greenlandic context and culture with inspiration from the other Arctic regions, where sharing circles or talking circles is a common communicating form among indigenous people in research and in learning. To be able to do that, we needed to explore Greenlandic Galatlit value, worldview, and knowledge together in traditions and cultural norms. And we have to turn to the literature about the specific Inuit Galatlit values, history, and culture. The concept of sharing circles has never been described in a Greenlandic context in the literature, and with conversation with knowledge holders confirmed that sharing circles or talking circles has not been used in Greenland as far as we know. We found that a great force in having the Greenlandic or Galalak interviewer who could situate herself among the participants and worldview and knowledge is related to culture according to the literature, and doing qualitative research in participants' own language is essential, especially when we are talking about people's feelings and perspectives. The word of health in Greenlandic, it's something on the right place. It means, and it is a holistic understanding of health that builds on values, relationship, environment, and Galallimangit country food and experiences. In early Inuit society, expressing dissatisfaction was not encouraged, and conflict could create individuals living in small communities. And today that is modesty and harmony is some of the core values among Greenlandic people in the culture. And based on the result from about our study in people's perception and experience with the Greenlandic health system, and research about the Inuit values, Center Public Health had developed community-based model for determinants of our health. The 13 indicators include lifestyle, of course, and biology and genetic, access to the healthcare and upbringing, childhood conditions and educations. But there is something else too, that local values are very important, and they are different from places to places, as well as the challenges and culture and language. It's important. We all know how important it is to be able to speak in own language, and well-being and family and relationships is very important, and community and to share with other people is important. And of course, the nature is the epicenter of most people here, and body, mind, and spirit. So thank you very much. It was what I have today.
Thank you very much, Christina and Inga-Lisa. Now what I'd like to do is let those that are watching know that they can send in questions, and we can bring these questions to the panel. And while we're waiting for those, I'd like to first of all thank you again for being here. And thank you for helping us start to explore something that you've all been doing for your careers, and that is how we really integrate Indigenous and Western ways of knowing from a community-based perspective to work on some of the really big problems, the One Health type issues that we're facing, especially in the Arctic, but really globally. And what I'd love to do is open it up for discussion among our panelists about what you found to be some of the challenges in working this way, and also the opportunities, maybe the types of problems that really are well suited to this type of work. And then, you know, how do we do this? How do we operationalize this in the way that we do research, in the way that we do education, and the way that we actually work on these problems? And what I'd like to do is, if it's okay, I'll start with Mike, because I know his time is a little bit limited. And then for the rest of you, if you don't mind just raising your hand, either actually literally raising your hand or on the little function on the reaction, and we'll move around the panel. Mike, do you want to go ahead and start us off?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, in my career with behavioral health and well-being, started in mid-70s when we took a look at our people were killing themselves, and homicides were rampant, and people in peril was established by Anchorage Daily News, focusing on the conditions of our people, and that I never forgot, and that's the reason why I decided to stand up and take a look at how we can restore ourselves, and from the highest rates of suicides, the highest rates of homicides, sexual abuse, domestic violence, you name it, in the alcohol effects. And I really appreciate what Jerry Mohat did in the university in his research. From that perspective, what I was dealing with directly, and trying to flip that approach on becoming healthy again. So in 1992, I began mushing for sobriety on the Iditarod, and that's what I did for 15 years, and mushing with a dog team on the Iditarod. It's a 1,000-mile race, and part of that is our, we always had dogs in our community. So in working with George Atla, who is a legendary musher in the world, winning the rendezvous and North Americans and other races in South 48, and he took a look at what we can do with education of our children. And of course, I've been on the education arena for all my life, and also served on a state board of education in Alaska for 8 years, and looking at how we can operationalize our languages and cultures in our education. Because I know that we have been, in growing up, we were prohibited from speaking our language and being punished for our languages by the government teachers, and also I think there were others that were treated in that way in religious based schools. But we went through that with rapid changes in our lives. But I think in the end, we took a look at what the elders were suggesting in terms of restoring our languages, restoring our hunting and fishing activities, because for a long time they came and regulated on when we can hunt and fish to feed our families. And we became criminals in the process. And that wasn't a good feeling. So we started to reawaken. And I think these international conferences, and I've been to Nuuk, Greenland before, and I really enjoyed staying in Nuuk with the Indian Circumpolar Conference was held there, and I really appreciated what Hans Pavia Rosing was doing in Greenland, and standing up for the Greenlandic people, and I just admire that, and I think that's the beginning of our people standing up to take back control of our lives in any way, in managing our lands, managing our health, managing our education, managing our environment, and our fish and wildlife. And I think that's just the beginning of One Health, and making sure that our communities are healthy again, and taking that responsibility once again. And of course, Oscar was on the executive council of ICC at the time, and working with Jimmy Stotts and from up north from Utrecht, and working with Russia and Greenland and Canadian provinces. So taking a look at what is happening throughout the Arctic has been very good for me to see what we can do in partnership with Western science and traditional knowledge to come together and agree to address these issues that are underlying. And we continue to do that, especially in the last administration in the United States, where our ways of life were into more of a challenge. And I think leadership all matters. So I just really thank this approach of One Health and our future depends on, I agree with 7 generations down the road. And I have 16 grandkids and 3 great grandkids now that I'm living for. So I look forward for more work with One Health and also working with other indigenous populations throughout the Arctic, and not only in Arctic, but in the Pacific Rim, Hawaiians, from Australia and from other countries that have indigenous populations. We all share the same concerns and issues that we deal with. So I just very excited on how we can address the impacts of climate change as well in our community, because we're being impacted as in our daily lives, as well as our fish and our wildlife. And I agree with what is happening to our caribou, and I think the population of moose is growing really rapidly in our area, and we're very concerned about them sustaining themselves with the habitat that we have, that we may have overpopulated our area with moose because they're eating themselves out, and that's another concern that I have. So I just wanted to thank all of you, and I look forward in going to Greenland maybe someday once again, and also to I haven't been to Russia. I want to go to Russia, and also of course Canada as well, with and take a look at what the other indigenous communities are doing about these issues. So I just wanted to thank all of you for giving me an opportunity to share a little bit of this morning. I'm sorry I can't be with you beyond 11 o'clock, but I'd be willing to hear more of all of your presentations and your thoughts and your work that you have been doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for that insight and experience. Would one of the other panelists like to comment? One of the things that was brought up in several of the presentations today that really struck home to me was how we're changing the way that we're looking at some of these issues that are really important to particularly indigenous communities in the Arctic. And that is going away from a problem-based approach to more of a strengths-based approach. And Jim talked about that, and it was brought up in the keynote that Jessica did, and so did our colleagues from Greenland and Denmark. And I'd love to try to maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I think it is a really positive way of approaching things. And if it's okay, Jessica, I'd love you to talk a little bit about a couple of the programs that you're working on with Anchor and Tamamta, and let folks know the great work you guys are doing there.
Yeah, no problem. Can you hear me okay? I'm just having internet troubles this morning. Okay, great. And maybe I'll save Anchor for Jim to touch upon, and I'll talk a little bit about Damamta. Damamta is a Sugpiaq word meaning all of us, but I also understand that it's similar in Yupik. But this project is a National Science Foundation NRTA graduate research traineeship, and the principal investigator is Dr. Courtney Carruthers, and I'm the co-principal investigator. But it's really been built up off of the work we've been doing in centering Indigenous knowledge in both academia and also in management systems. As Mike shared with you, we've had a lot of changes in our ecosystem. For Mike and I, we've really seen the rapid decline of the Chinook salmon in the past decade, and that has really strong implications on our mental health and well-being as fishing people. It's more, I feel like I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but it's more than just it's more than impacting our physical health, but our spiritual, social, emotional health, because fishing or hunting, living our values are the ways in which we pass on our culture to our children. It's the way that we show love for our elders by sharing our catch. And so when we aren't able to do those things, it really has a lot of detrimental impacts to our individual well-being, but also community well-being. So Damamta, one of the reasons why we wrote this grant was that there hasn't been enough Indigenous participation in management and governing systems. And that is so needed because, as we all know, Indigenous people bring our whole selves and this holistic thinking to management or governance. And we wanted to increase the number of Indigenous students entering into a graduate degree in fisheries. And so Damamta will help to support 5 Indigenous or allies in their pursuit of a graduate degree in fisheries for 5 years. So this fall, we have our first cohort that will be entering the program as a fellow. And then we will also be hosting seminars where we bring people like yourself, all of you, into our university to share what you're doing at your respective campuses or homelands as it relates to bringing and centering Indigenous knowledge in academia. We'll also have elders and residents, and then fall retreats in place. So our students will, be visiting a fish camp or a right across the river here in Fairbanks, we have Howard Luke's camp. That would be like a great place to share. And our students aren't just like building relationships, but they're out on the land. And we know that the land has so much to teach us. And so it's very much a program that's going to be centering Indigenous knowledge and also working at the within institutions to increase these partnerships with Indigenous peoples and knowledge systems. So we're really excited about that. And it's built upon a couple of projects we've already been engaged in, such as the State of Alaska Salmon and People Project, which Mike was an instrumental part of in shaping the work that we did there. You can go to the State of Alaska Salmon and People Project online, and you'll see some of the work that came out of there and a lot of data. And we also had Wilson Justin, Ben Stevens, Liza Mack, Jonathan Samuelson, a lot of Indigenous scholars who helped to shape that work. And then we have one project called Indigenizing Salmon Science and Management, which documents the breadth and depth of Indigenous knowledge as it relates to salmon governance. So Damamta builds upon a lot of this work, and very similar to what you all shared this morning, in that there's so much to be learned when we bring together the best of our different knowledge systems and really take the time and make the space to do that. I see this One Health program as really working hard towards that goal, but also making the space like this talk where we can really share our ideas. And everybody watching online, I know you all are doing really excellent work, and so we just don't always know about it, right? So these times and spaces are really valuable for learning across contexts what's being done. And I'm thinking towards the future with my students is what kind of partnerships and networks can they build across contexts to further their work. So I hope that's helpful in just sharing a little bit about what's happening here at UAF.
Thank you, Jessica. That was super helpful. Thanks. And I agree with you. I think making the space for people to share is really important and a little bit more challenging now with COVID, but we're getting there. Jim, did you want to talk a little bit about Anchor?
I'd be happy to. And let me begin as just sharing personally, it's so wonderful to be on a panel with Dr. Black, who I've known for a number of years. And it's just one of many people who are coming forward and really being a strong advocate for their community. And it's just been just really a treat to listen to you right now. I really loved what you had to say. And I can't wait to hear the perspectives and thoughts from our colleagues in Greenland, and also to express my appreciation for showing those beautiful pictures. Every time I've visited your beautiful land, it's just captivated me, and the people have been so kind and so welcoming. So I can't wait to hear your observations. I will talk for a little bit about Anchor, and then I would like to, if it's okay, speak maybe just for a minute or two about Susan and Jared's fine presentation. And I think just something that really struck me a lot when I was listening to what you had to say, that I think everyone has touched on a little bit thus far in our discussion. First, about Anchor, maybe in 3 or 4 sentences. First of all, what does it mean? It's a set of letters, and it means the Alaska Native Collaborative Hub for Research on Resilience. And we're attempting to do 2 things. The first is we're trying to provide a place which we haven't really had the funding or the opportunity ever to do, which is in one place to bring Alaska Native people from across rural Alaska who are actually working in their communities to develop solutions from their own community, from the ground up, to promote youth well-being as a hedge against suicide. And so the suicide prevention work, we feel the Western research and science has really been missing out, and it's been off the radar, these really innovative community efforts that we feel have been very successful and very effective. And the communities, we feel, have the solutions, and we really want to document those. The second thing we're really interested in is a research study that is exploring on thinking about communities and their strengths and the things communities as collectives do that actually protect their young people from suicide. So the study's looking at on the basis of the strengths of communities, can we actually identify communities that have accomplished low rates of suicide? And it's very exciting work, and I look forward to, we have this little line we like to share that Anchor is about, we would like to change the narrative on suicide from risk reduction to strengths and well-being, because that's what leads to change, and that's that's what creates healthy young people. The impression I had from Jared and Susan's talk that I wanted to share is that there's so many things you touched upon. The one that most resonated with me is this idea of relationship and relational methods, and that unfortunately I think Western science has all too often ignored how knowledge production occurs in a relationship when it's about people or when it's about animals. And you know, when you think about it, it becomes so obvious. But then if you look at the scientific research for the last century, it's just, it hasn't been an emphasis at all. And um, um, I had an opportunity to spend some time a few years back with Albert Marshall, and he emphasized, I thought, a really interesting point that I think those of us who come from a Western scientific perspective really need to be mindful of. He talked about thinking about two-eyed seeing as maybe two pathways, and the importance of the pathways to be able to move along in their own direction, and that one pathway shouldn't take over the other. And I think he was talking about many things with this metaphor, but one is really a need for that idea of scientific skepticism to become more of scientific humility, and that there's a tendency for Western science to privilege its own methods, its own ways of seeing over that other pathway. And really, you know, I think he was saying, you know, it's important to stay in your lane, and that we have to approach this issue of integration really carefully as scientists, and it really needs to be community directed if it ever occurs. Um, and then you really start discovering things. I thought the talk by Susan and Jared really emphasized that the new knowledge formation that occurs is really giving voice to knowledge that is already there. I'll stop right there, and I'd love to hear some thoughts from our colleagues in Greenland.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Yeah, Christina or Ingelisa, would you like to comment on that?
Do you want me to go first, Ingelisa? Okay, yeah. So it's such a pleasure to be on this panel, and I think and thank you for asking us, Jim. I think we're taking in all of the input. But Dr. Black, you touched on an important issue of like academia and education, and I think what Ingelisa and we've been working together for 15 years, and for the first 10 years of those 15 years, we only worked from what we learned in at university, or Ingelisa has trained as a midwife and has worked as a research coordinator for 15 years, and it just, I mean, no one paid attention to why anything, like things weren't changing. So we've had the same epidemiological surveys for 30 years, and nobody understood why things weren't changing, despite the fact that all of these problems had been documented. And I don't know, I don't know how, I think it happened through the collaboration across the Arctic, and Ingelisa is totally leading this work, and I'm just humbly supporting her as best as I can, to really stop and shift the paradigm, as I said also when I presented myself, to see we have to frame things in a different direction, and Greenland is you know, governed by Inuit, but it's a very Danish system. So we're really struggling and fighting to try to open people's eyes to the importance of much like integrating. We talk a lot about, I mean, we don't always talk about indigenous knowledge, but that really is what it is. But often in Greenland, people will say local knowledge, or, you know, they'll say things that are it's tied to place and land and all that, but opening that perspective. And One Health actually hasn't been something that's been discussed a lot in Greenland, and I think it's because we're just now trying to build a collaboration across not just disciplines but sciences. But I think in English you can add to this, but it's just people are trained, also Greenlandic researchers, in a Western system. So coming back to Greenland, often people will have gone abroad and studied in Denmark or in other places, and there's so little attention paid to the importance of community strength solutions. But despite of this, anyone you ask, what makes you healthy? Like what makes you thrive? What makes you happy? Family, land, food. So what we're trying to do now, I think, and I'm having trouble putting this in words because it's something that we're really working hard on this. It's trying to make people see the natural connection of what they know everyone knows that it makes them happy. This is what their heart is. And then to take that and put that into all of the programs and health promoting strategies and all of the stuff that you then put into the world to make changes. And I think we've come away, but actually having a model of determinants of health, of our health, that's based on Galaslit values, having that as a framework of everything that we do is a huge beginning for us. And it's actually now getting into government programs and strategies, and that gives it an impact that I'm hopeful will help change. So, but really, Ingelise is leading this work, so I'm just humbly trying to put it into words. You might want to add, Ingelise.
I knew that I had all those feelings and values inside, but I was not able to understand and to bring it out. I was trained as a midwife in Denmark, and when I came home, I didn't even know how to lead a delivery in a Greenlandic way. My mother is still going strong, and she is 91. And she is a big, and Christina is a big inspiration to get those out. We have 300 years of colonization, so even we have to go through ourselves to make this happen to a real thing. It is so difficult to work even with ourselves. So now we are on the way, but we know it's a long way. But our determinants of health has, as Christina said, is very important, and we use it in everything. Yeah, even as it's difficult to put it in words. I have a presentation for some week ago, and I talk about the indigenous knowledge and the perceptions of health. And then I said many people believe that eating Greenlandic food and the flowers and everything on the earth that help to not having COVID-19. And people listening was laughing. The not Danish, but the people trained in the Danish, they didn't believe and laugh. But you can discuss that, of course, but that's that. But this is just a way of thinking. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes, we do. And thank you very much for sharing that. I'd like to finish this first go around with where we started with Susan and Jared, and any comments you might have on this co-production of knowledge and particularly from a community-based platform.
Sure. You want me to go first, Jared?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess a couple things that have occurred to me as people, and one is this around One Health and the importance, or not the importance, the fact that this is, in my experience, foundational to the thinking and being of Indigenous peoples. And it's kind of funny because we bring this up almost as a new concept in the Western world, yet it's just part of the way of being that people are, how they live with the environment. Coming back to relationships that Jim was mentioning, I think I'm trained as a veterinarian, as a natural scientist, not as a social scientist. And I fumbled my way through my career, but really it was through building relationships that things worked out. And I think that is absolutely key. You started with a question about challenges and problems, and then also a strength-based approach, Arlie. And I think the challenges with building relationships, particularly in the Canadian North, I think similarly in Alaska, is often time and money. And it's mostly money. It's the fact that I can fly around the world twice before I can go to Uluhokto. That I can, the accommodations are $250 a night. But one of the opportunities we had, in particular with Matilda's work, was that we could get free accommodation for an entire summer. So the longer my team is able to stay in the North, spend time with people, build those relationships, the stronger the work becomes, the more trust is built. So I think that's kind of the key pieces around that. And it's also, and I don't know if there was a COVID question coming, but there always is. So I think one of the things that has allowed us to survive and allowed the program to survive during COVID has been that these relationships are there. The communities are taking leadership in the programs, and they've been able to go along, yet still with some internet challenges, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But yeah, I think those are the key points I'd like to touch on. Over to you, Jared.
Sure. I'll also emphasize relationships. Really, one thing I've noticed in the Seven Lakes here and all the Six Nations is really pushing against this whole management framework. When people start to speak about management and management tables, really the Indigenous people push back and say, well, that doesn't make sense from our perspective. We were never managing wildlife before. We're in relationship with wildlife, like a deep relationship. So what I've noticed, what we've been doing, myself included, is like we aren't really management planning. We're relationship planning. And these relationships are based on values. They're based on mutual respect between ourselves and non-human beings and the landscape they inhabit. And the fact that Indigenous people, I'd say, at least in this part of the world, can pretty easily say we see ourselves as stewards of the land. And so, and in this relationship planning, we really see it as like a place where people can come together, like all people. And I kind of see that as truly One Health. It's just acknowledging that the health of the land and the health of species is just totally tied to the health of people, and vice versa. The health of people is tied to the health of land. So in all this relationship planning, what I'm noticing is Indigenous people, at least in the Southern Lakes region that I'm involved in, are really pushing for a place for spirituality and ceremony, so that relationship that we have with the land can keep being renewed with our people. And one other thought as everyone was talking, and I think one problem I have with management terminology is it's kind of technocratic. It has like a intimidating element to me. So I think when you go to people in the community and say, do you want to be involved in this management plan? You can get a little bit pushback there, but you say, do you want to be involved in this relationship plan? And then start talking about their values. That's really going to get you a lot of buy-in. It's just some of the thoughts floating around my head. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those perspectives. I think this is really a paradigm shift, particularly for those of us who are trained in Western ways of knowing. and really appreciate you guys bringing this to our attention and explaining it in such a beautiful way. We do have some questions from our folks listening, and I'll start with one from Emily Jenkins, and I'll put this out to the whole group. It says, in my capacity as the International Arctic Scientific Committee, how can we work internationally to encourage and integrate Indigenous and local knowledge when these are fundamentally best built at a local level? Emily always asks the hard questions.
I can touch on that briefly.
Thank you, Susan.
I think the point about things being built on the local level is absolutely true. So it can't, there is not a cookie cutter approach. Even within the communities that I work with, things are developed differently. But I think part of the way to address that is through opportunities like this conference, and with sharing the knowledge around the different types of work that's being done. And some of there are clear operating principles that can be shared, and approaches that can be shared. They certainly can't, like I say, it's not cookie cutter, but I think we can learn a lot by talking about it among different programs.
Hey, Arlie, I'd like to try. That is such a good question. I think that really cuts to the chase in terms of what the core issue here is, and it also provides an opportunity for me to acknowledge some of my colleagues, and I'd like to share something that Billy Charles and Simeon John, along with my close colleague Stacy Rasmus, wrote recently in an article, and there's a word I need to explain just a little bit before I read this passage, because I think it provides it's provided an explanation for me towards understanding in terms of the answer to this question. And this will be familiar, I think, because in Greenlandic, you say it in a similar way. The word in Yupik is kasik, and it can be a noun, which relates to men's house or communal house, or it can also be used as a verb. And as a verb, it relates to this encircling process. And then in Billy and Simeon's words, they talk about Kasiak in structure as in function. It's the circle and the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And the process of encircling begins at conception and connects people to place and all life, corporal and metaphysical within it. The approach encompasses and has implications for knowledge production. With respect to knowledge development, knowledge is collective, relational, and cyclical, and will continue its development through kinship-based cycles, involving the social networks of ancestors to descendants. And so one can't understand knowledge, one can't understand oneself without your relationship to this circle of family and community, the landscape, and the animals. And so when Billy and Simeon emphasize this idea of Kasiak, they also emphasize every community has a Kasiak. And if you want to access what makes people feel good in terms of well-being, if you want to access the local perspectives, it's important to find and understand those cultural protocols and the way of encircling in the community. And that's your access point to knowledge. And I've always found that really helpful, them explaining that to me. Back to you, Arlie.
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate you bringing that point up. And I could just step in just for a second, and then we'll go back to our panelists. I think the root of Emily's question is, again, this paradigm shift. And you explained it beautifully, Jim. you know, we're so used to looking at things from a top-down approach, right? How do we work across the Arctic and do all this work, instead of saying what's being done across the Arctic in these communities? Let's learn from them and share that knowledge, and start at the grassroots approach and build upwards. You know, learn from each other's best practices. Yeah, there'll be some cultural differences, but these problems we face across the Arctic, they don't stop at the Canadian border or the Russian border or the Greenlandic border. I think that is really one of the big paradigm shifts that we need to start considering, is that maybe instead of looking at it as this sort of legislating down to what should be done, listening up from what is being done and what needs to be done. Other comments on that question? I think it's a great one. Yeah, Christina.
Just a thought in continuation of that. I think for Greenland, what we're also trying to do now, because I think one of the challenges in the international work, it's also like, what are the voices that get privileged? Who had the opportunity to go to college? Who could attend a conference? Who could, I mean, board a plane and fly across the world? And I mean, there are all of these steps that are before the fact that who gets to speak. And the way the funding is built in, and I mean that's also different, of course, across all of our regional contexts as well. But an important development for us in Greenland, I think, is right now we're working, and this is the Greenlandic Research Council, to actually develop ethical guidelines that are, you know, looking at different guidelines across the Arctic for inspiration, but also putting Greenlandic values at the forefront, in order for us to have a starting point where all research, because often researchers come from the outside and they go into Greenland and they take data out of Greenland and they're not necessarily sharing it with people in Greenland. So I mean, that's the classic science that's still going on, I'm sure not only in Greenland. And so it's also trying to establish some guidelines, some regulations for Greenland, because we don't have them, to make sure that people actually look into the UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights, that they actually pay attention to values. And I think Jared, you talked about starting the conversation with the values, and that's actually something that we're also doing. Like, whatever we do, we start asking about values, because we need to understand where people are coming from. That's how we're trying to bring in the Indigenous perspective in all that we do. So for Greenland, because we don't have ethical guidelines in research, that's an important starting point for us, that we're hoping will also lead to a better, I mean, less disconnection between international collaborations that are sort of going on the top of Greenland, and then the local and Indigenous perspectives that are grounded at the more local level. So just a sort of a regional perspective on that.
Thank you, Christina. Other comments from the panel?
Yeah, I'd like to share.
Thanks,
I think
Jessica.
as we shift our paradigms, it's really about involving Indigenous people from the very beginning. And I know that gets said a lot, but we have to put that in action. And so around everything from, you know, what's even guiding research, for example, is it truly from the community, or have the questions been created and then seeking community support? Really taking a reflexive look at these projects. And it takes time. I remember listening to Dr. Teresa John talk, and she talked about how researchers should spend at least 1 year in community before ever engaging in research. And I remember, well, I agree that time, right, is how trust is built and how you get to really know what is needed. But, you know, we work within systems that aren't always responsive to that. And by systems, I'm thinking of like funding agencies who have such a different view of time. And so I think our jobs as people within these systems is to push back as well and really talk about the necessity for the time we spend in you know, and that we wouldn't want to be doing research anyways with communities if there isn't a strong relationship built.
I think Jessica's having a little trouble with her internet. We'll give a second here and see if she comes back. Because I would really like to hear what she says.
Oh, sorry, I'm just having internet problems. I hope you can hear me, but I'll just wrap up and say we hear a lot about community-based participatory research or tribally driven research, but are we truly doing that? And can we push back on some of the funding agencies to be more reflexive of these different worldviews where time is more fluid and trust has to be built, and reciprocity? These aren't just words, these have real meaning. Redistribution, are we honoring our Indigenous knowledge experts in the way we would do a PhD, you know, in Western academia? Are we making space to really think through some of these concepts? So I'll just end there. I think if we want to really shift the paradigm, we have to make a concerted effort to take the time to do that. And that's not always a really quick process that aligns with funding guidelines. And we have to push back.
That's a great point. Thank you very much for bringing that up. Other comments from the panel? We have another question then. And this one is from Lisa Bush in Sitka. She says, thank you for all the important work you're doing in different parts of the Arctic. My question is, what advice would you give to a Western scientist to take the first step toward taking a community-based approach? In other words, how do you initiate it for someone who hasn't done it before? You're highlighted, Christina. Do you want to start? No?
Well, I'm not necessarily the most experienced here, so I think others would be better at giving advice.
Okay. Do any of the panelists want to start with that question?
I'll just jump in by highlighting Jessica in many ways answered that for us already. I thought, you know, just in her her citing Teresa John and her, you have to go out and be with the community. And that's just always such a great place to start. And we Western science doesn't emphasize for this kind of work in health how important visiting is, and how important spending a year with the community is really a good idea. And I understand that we all can't move to a place in rural Greenland, for example, for an entire year. But over the course of a year, we can form relationships, and we'll learn a lot. And it may even change the nature of the research question we're even going to start working on as a result. And I thought Jessica's point is just so central that the people who often fund us and make our work possible, this is not always readily apparent to them, and it should be. And we all, those of us who do work in Western science, really have a responsibility to emphasize this is crucially important, and we're not doing this so well right now. Well, we could.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Jessica. I agree. I think Jessica did a great job of answering that question. We have a couple other new questions. The sharing circle approach validates and respects Indigenous people. What platform would be best to demonstrate to the community that their input has been impactful and to help continue the dialogue?
I have a quick comment following on Ingelise's work with the sharing circles that we've tried to develop in a Greenlandic context. And what you just said, Jim, just visiting, coming back, sharing results. It could be inviting for another sharing circle, but it could also just be visiting, sitting down, having coffee. At least we have a lot of coffee in Greenland, and just talking to people and let them know that this is where we took the research, but also a part of engaging with community is also, it's a continuous dialogue because it's a relationship, and I mean, there's feedback going on that, I mean, it doesn't end with the project. It's a knowledge sharing that continues. So I mean, go back and visit and talk to people. I think that would be a good way to do it. At least that's what we try to do, and are often asked to do, because it's a natural way of keeping the relationship.
Thank you, Christina. Other thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I can just touch on that because I think the example that I gave about the dolphin and union caribou and the process around that is one where the Indigenous knowledge was really used. And quite often I think what happens is there's consultation processes, but they don't move beyond, okay, there's some discussion, but we're going to carry on and do what we're going to do anyway. And in this case, there was quite a body of traditional knowledge that had been gathered, both from 2003 and 2018. And the wildlife manager at the who was bringing all these different groups together was excellent. And he was incredibly inclusive, and he brought people together from the communities. He brought Environment Canada, he brought the wildlife managers together, and he brought the scientists that were doing work on this. And everybody sat down and looked at the whole body of information, and the knowledge that the harvesters had about where the caribou were. And they're saying, you know, you can't just run these surveys, these transects, because the caribou are further away. And despite all odds, and thank goodness because of good weather, the full survey as planned could happen. And so I said, you know, the results came out, and everybody had input into that design. And I think ultimately there has been far more, everybody has agreed on it and agreed on the measures that need to be taken to make sure there's caribou for the future. And so, and I put a lot of that credit to the fellow at the top who brought everyone together and kept it incredibly inclusive. So I think that was, and it seems so common sense. Like, of course this should happen, but it doesn't that often.
Thank you, Susan. Other panelists want to comment on that question?
I guess for me, you'd hope it happened organically too, and that, you know, as you're doing this community research or sharing circle, you're always going to have the people involved. So you're always going to be discussing how is this going to be work for you the most, or at the end of the day, how is this information going to come back to you and be stored for your community? So this is always maintaining that line of communication.
Thank you, Jared. Other questions, or I mean comments on that question? I'm sorry. We have one final question, if there aren't any other comments, and that is, how do we show people, especially those that might live in cities outside of the Arctic, that we all have relationships and responsibilities to the land, water, plants, and animals around us? I think that's a great question, and really highlighted by some of the issues we faced in our previous administration here in the US.
I can touch on it. I think one of the most revealing insights I had was as a grad student, I was going to the communities and presenting PowerPoint presentations in office rooms or community halls, and people keep saying, "Come out on the land with us. Come out on the land with us." And when I went out on the land with them, everything changed. My credibility changed. My insights, my understanding of the system changed. It's obviously hard to get everybody from the city to go out and have that experience, but if we can build on that, find ways that they can have some sort of experience like that, I think that goes further than anything else.
Thank you, Susan. Other thoughts or comments on that? Well, while you're thinking about it, I do want to read a comment in the chat for all of you. It just came in, and actually, I'm sorry, it just went away, but there was a very nice comment that had shown up. Basically was saying it was a breath of fresh air to hear the way that you guys are approaching things and how humble you are and the aura that comes from you, and what was said with a lot of gratitude. Any other comments that any of the panelists would like to make in closing? We have about 3 minutes left.
Arlie, can I just mention?
Please
So,
do.
Yeah, I do have some experience along with my research partners, which include community members, on dialogues. So we have some dialogues which are similar to sharing circles, and also multi-generational interviews between, say, grandparents, parents, and grandchildren. And I find those methods, they really are Indigenous centered methods to be very, just inclusive and a great way to talk with people from community who are definitely the experts in their own lives and knowledge systems. And within sharing circles and the dialogues, there are this feeling of, the power of a circle to begin with, just getting people in a circle. And then also this equity, if you will, like everybody has a voice. And I think that's a really powerful way to build trust and also hear from people, because, as people share, it may jog someone else's memory of something that they experienced as well. And then the conversation and this talking and sharing just takes on a life of its own, and which is what you want, really, because people know how to best share about their lives. And so I find it a really amazing method to listen and learn, and also just share around the topics that you're interested in learning more about. But it also makes the circle itself helps to build trust, because people feel like they're all equal in the circle, if that makes sense, and sort of shifts the power dynamic that can often occur when researchers are researching something, but brings forth this feeling of equity and inclusion, which I think is really important, because as researchers, as scholars, we're also really working hard to remake research relationships that have been harmful to many Indigenous people and people of color historically and even present. So the sharing circles and also the dialogues are really powerful tool in helping to do that.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was very well said and very true. Well, we've got about a minute left, so I would like to take a moment to just say a very sincere thank you to this wonderful panel that has taken time out of their busy schedule, doing the wonderful work that they do, to join us today and share their experience and their knowledge. I think we have all learned a lot, and I think as we move forward and try to continue to work with these paradigm shifts. Some of the key words that came out to me today were things like relationships, that we're not managing things, we're relationship planning. I love that idea and approach. Reciprocity, that we are on equal footing with each other. That this two-eyed approach is also a two-way approach. It's not just a one-way approach. And respect for each other, mutual respect. And then taking what we've learned, because when people share that knowledge, it's precious, it's priceless. It's our responsibility to implement it, not just listen, but to do something with it together. Thank you so very much. I really, really appreciate what you've shared with us today. And I hope that you will join us for as much of the conference as you can and continue on the wonderful work that you're doing. Koyana Chaknak.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your work with us.
Thank you. Bye.